Welcome to the Legendary Upside podcast. My name is Pat Crane. You can find all of my content at legendaryupside.com. With me today is Connor Rogers of NBC, of the Fantasy Football Happy Hour, of the NFL Stock Exchange podcast. Connor, how's it going?
Good, Pat. It's good to reunite, man. How are you?
Yeah, it is. We met on the set doing some Matthew Berry's Fantasy Football Happy Hour together. I did some guest spots with you guys and was very impressed with your knowledge of all the rookies. Thank you, have been listening to your NFL Stock Exchange podcast with Trevor Sikkema, just devouring it, because you guys have been really diving into the rookies, and not just like now, like I am, but somehow on top of all the NFL stuff you do, you're doing like summer scouting on these guys and have been following these guys for years. So I think some really crucial context for my listeners here, who I think are kind of playing catch up a little bit like me on this class, getting some context around this rookie class.
And I feel like that's the reality for 90% of people that are working in football. Maybe even that number might be higher, whether you're working in fantasy, whether you're a team reporter, whatever it may be, because the reality is the calendar only allows for so much. And the draft has always been, kind of my bread and butter, even going back to Bleacher Reports, what I wanted to do. And what Trevor and I have realized with Stock Exchange is that we didn't know until we just did it, is there was an appetite the summer before an NFL draft to give people a baseline. And when we started doing it a few years ago, it was a very slow trickle. And then this year we really noticed how much people love it, because they could just go into a college season and they got their 100 players or so that they have their eyes on for the draft. And there's going to be guys that things don't go right for them. There's going to be guys that go back to school. But, if there's 40% that are a big part of the draft, that's a major win. And I think for Trevor and I, it's helped our process, because we get to track all of it for about 10 months. By the time you get to really this time of year, it just feels a little bit of a lighter load, or you can get into UDFAs, or you can get into deep in day 3 of the draft. So I'm lucky I get to do it. I love doing it. And I hope it helps anyone that, we don't expect anyone to agree with our opinions, but if we give you background info that helps, if we talk about a player a certain way and that leads people down the right path, then it's really worth it. So I love doing it, and it's something I hope I do forever.
Yeah, and I would recommend, like, I've been going back and listening to some of the older stuff now, and it's just interesting to hear you guys talk about Jayden Daniels back in, like, I think it was maybe November, and he's like, I don't know, I think this guy could maybe go round 1, and now he could go top 3. Yeah, and so it's like but that context is interesting of like, oh, this guy really came on, where you guys were kind of like, I'm feeling a little bold, I think I'm putting him round 1, and that, I think, not to say that a late riser can't ultimately go on to have success, but I still kind of want to know that this guy kind of came more out of nowhere, or made a huge rise as an older prospect in his final season. Whereas, you guys are talking Drake Maye, Caleb Williams the whole time is that top 2. So even stuff like that, I think, can be really helpful for people. Again, just kind of playing catch up. And I want to start with some of the quarterback stuff. Like, I'm not really that interested, honestly, from a fantasy football perspective, in kind of like debating who should be the quarterback 1 or whatever, because Caleb Williams is going to be the quarterback 1 according to the market.
Yeah.
He's very, very likely to go number 1 in the draft, and he will be drafted first in dynasty formats, in best ball formats, and I think that's fine. What I am interested in is how far behind should Drake Maye and Jayden Daniels be right now in best ball. It's actually Jayden Daniels who's going second behind Caleb Williams, and then there's a pretty big gap in best ball drafts to Drake Maye. There's like a 40 pick gap between Williams and Maye. There's only an 8 pick gap between Williams and Daniels because of his rushing ability. But as a fantasy football prospect, Drake Maye feels like he checks almost all the boxes. Not like, he's not got the true running ability where, you're like a true dual threat, but it's like a Justin Herbert, Josh Allen kind of rushing ability. He's got that. He's a willing, capable deep thrower. I love what you guys are saying about him kind of playing within structure in addition to playmaking. He's willing to take chances. He scrambles out of a clean pocket, which I like. Like, I think we're going to get some scrambling from him, some of that added mobility with the size that should translate. Like, I don't really understand the gap between Williams and Maye from a fantasy football perspective. Even if Williams is the clear number one, do you think that there should be, a kind of a tier that he's in his own from fantasy football?
That gap's a little big for me as well. When you look at Drake Maye, I mean, he's ran for 16 touchdowns in the last 2 years. And it's not like he had 1 year where he ran for 13 and the other year he ran for 3. I mean, the splits are 7 and 9. So I think there's a consistent pattern of him being a legitimate red zone threat. And now, of course, with Jayden Daniels, I mean, really, one of the main beauties of his game is that between the 20s, he could take off and he's not looking to
Yeah.
take 8 yards and slide. He's looking to, which is a detriment at times, he's looking to make 3 guys miss and get as many yards as he can because I don't think he protects himself very well. There's some hits on tape where you're like, you will not be able to do this at the NFL level. But you will be able to be a successful runner. That's why everybody's so high on Jayden Daniels from a fantasy perspective long term. I think that with Drake, I think he's going to be a really accomplished passer in a couple of years. That if that running bonus remains with him, just from a pure touchdown equity standpoint, that gap should be closer, in my opinion. It really, really should. Now, what I will say is, away from the fantasy side of it is, I think even NFL teams are looking at it and wondering if Jayden Daniels should go before Drake Maye. So the talent, evaluation with these guys is not very different. While I agree that Caleb Williams is going to be the consensus number one guy, he's going to be a top guy in fantasy, in dynasty, just because the arm talent, he's somebody that can run. He's more twitchier in the pocket and out of the pocket rather than Jayden Daniels. I mean, when he hits the gas, it's like, oh, this is now we're dealing with a running back, or it feels like a wide receiver off of a jet sweep kind of runner at that level. So yeah, I'm really high on Drake Maye. I think that something that's really hard to evaluate with fantasy, but something that definitely matters a lot to me and definitely trickles into fantasy is Drake Maye is going to play at 230 pounds. And this isn't someone that played at 205 all year and is walking into the combine like he just drank mass gainer for 3 months. This is someone who that big frame is going to hold up. And I think we've seen a lot of different guys over the years. I mean, Fields is an example of a guy that runs, but also gets hurt every single year. Jayden Daniels is going to have to learn to protect himself to a degree because he's not somebody that's going to play at 225 pounds, where I think that has to be taken into account for the long-term nature of where you're taking him as well.
Yeah, Danny Kelly and Nate Tice have the Johnny Knoxville tweet out there. I don't know if you've seen that, but there's some hits that he takes that
his
are
legs
pretty,
go up in the
pretty
air.
brutal. His legs go up in the air. Yeah. The thing with Daniels too, like Maye, he's 6'4", 230. Daniels is also listed at 6'4", but 210. And
he's
so
slender,
it's like
narrow.
Yeah. Right. So that's concerning with Lamar's slender, but Lamar doesn't really take hits like that.
He's a magician. He's 1-on-1. I always say this to people. Lamar, it's almost like he could have 3 guys trying to tackle him in a phone booth and he comes out of it untouched. It's just unique.
Yeah. So I kind of personally, like for dynasty purposes where like the longer term outlook is so crucial, like I like Maye more than Daniels. I feel really confident that Maye is going to be like a long-term NFL starter. I think Daniels will probably be that, but it's a little riskier to me. Do you have any feelings? Like,
no, I am with you.
Okay.
I have the bust rate. The bust rate to me is higher on Daniels than Maye.
What about between Maye and Williams?
And fantasy. Yeah,
I know we're assuming neither of these guys bust, but
right. I think it's closer than the general public feels. Clearly, the NFL. I mean, there's not really any chatter around Maye as the number 1 overall pick. I think it's a lot closer. I think that I'm a little surprised that there's not chatter of, hey, teams are going through the eval. Now, let me say this. Coaches get into this process very, very late. Everything we're hearing right now is based on front office and scouting evaluators and media evaluators. Coaches are always the last piece of the puzzle. They come in and they can kind of just shake everything up into a blender, so you never know how things can change. But I personally think the tier, it's pretty close to me. We're actually doing the quarterback episode on Stock Exchange in a couple of days here. So I've just been grinding quarterbacks for about a week now. The tier of Williams and Maye is pretty close, where I could almost argue that it's a tier. And then the next tier for me, not from a fantasy perspective, would be Penix and Daniels. And
Oh,
obviously,
wow.
Daniels is in a different world fantasy wise than Penix because he runs, and that's not in the equation of Penix's game as much anymore. But for actual long term NFL success, that's how I would gap it, and that plays into fantasy because, like you said, to be effective, especially in Dynasty, you need to be
Yeah.
starting every year
Yeah.
rather than out of the
Right.
league or on a team as a second or third stringer.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's interesting that Penix is the next name you mentioned because McCarthy seems to be the guy that the NFL is really
Yep.
talking up as like maybe this guy goes to the Broncos or the Vikings, like 11 or 12. Um, and then Bo Nix, I've heard talk of, sneaking into the first round. It seems like Penix could end up being like maybe even a round 3 pick, or he seems like the least likely to go round 1 anyway. Um, any thoughts on these guys as like their actual draft position? Like, do you think Penix is still live to go round 1?
I think he's got a shot. So much of it depends on his medicals at the combine. And, I've
Hmm.
I've heard really good things that he's already gone through, evaluations because you have as an individual, you want to do that. You don't want to go into the combine blindfolded and get blindsided. But once again, every team doctor's different. I've had one team in the past years tell me, hey, that running back's off our board. His knee's going to be shot in 2 years. I've had other teams tell me nothing came up for us. I mean,
Hmm.
so it's really the Wild West on how teams. It's funny to look back at the year. This is going a little off track, but the year Nick Chubb and Sony Michel were in the same draft, I remember, and how closely they were drafted together, and how the perception was Nick Chubb medically would be an issue long term, while Sony Michel was, this guy with a clean bill. And then when you actually talk to the teams, it was the other way around. They loved the recovery of Chubb despite him having a catastrophic college injury, and some things came up on Sony Michel that were very, very concerning. And here we
Hmm.
are in 2024. Look how that's played out. So
Yep.
you
Yep.
don't fully know in February. I think projections, I feel pretty comfortable that, Caleb Williams is probably going to go number 1 overall. It feels like there's a good chance at 2 and 3, it's some combination of May and Daniels, at least in the top 5. I think McCarthy is going to end up being a top 15 pick. It wouldn't be my personal take, but I think based on the traits he has, the age, um, trying to correct his flaws or learning curve is something that a lot of coaches believe they can do, being a quicker processor. And then, of course, Knicks and Penix have a shot to go round 1. It's just a matter of how the teams. No, we got to get through free agency. Nobody knows where Kirk Cousins is going to go. Nobody knows where
Right.
Justin Fields could be traded to, because you think Atlanta could be in this mix. You nailed it with that trifecta of Minnesota, Denver, and the Raiders. All three are doing a ton of work on quarterbacks right now, where they're just trying to figure out who's going to answer the phone, if they can move up
Hmm.
at all. So
Yeah. Yeah.
when they get through their evaluations, will they sit there and be like, well, we couldn't get up for Drake Maye or Jayden Daniels, but we actually really liked McCarthy or Nix or Penix, one of those three, and we're comfortable here now. So, yeah, I think there's a shot that 5 quarterbacks go in the first round, and it's not like a non-chance that 6 go in the first round, which is really, really wild, but it's not a non-zero.
McCarthy worries me because like he's listed at around 200 pounds. Dane Brugler in his ranks had him at 195.
Wow.
And people aren't really talking about that. We just did the Bryce Young weight thing, and it was like, oh, thank God he got above 200 for the combine. But no one's really talking about the weight for McCarthy. I think from a fantasy football perspective, the weight just kind of furthers the concern that I have about a skill set that might not be that fantasy friendly, might be kind of a lower volume guy to start. Are you like, even if McCarthy goes round 1, like, let's say he goes top 15, Penix sneaks into the back end of round 1, or Knicks, like, are you more excited about those guys with worse draft capital just because of the skill set from a fantasy football perspective?
By far. I think that number 1 with Penix, I think he number 1 is the most pro-ready passer in this draft, and that obviously doesn't make him the best prospect. But if you're throwing somebody out there today that needs to make all the checks at the line of scrimmage and really know, 3 reads that he's going to get through quickly and get the ball out, that's the guy right now. Caleb, I'm very impressed with his full field reading and his accuracy. May, definitely getting better. Daniels, I think throwing with anticipation is one of his weaker points, but he's such a gifted athlete that you wonder if he could just athlete his way through his development, which we've seen guys do in this generation. I don't feel that way necessarily about McCarthy. I feel like there's times where a lot of it can be fixated on half the field, or, hey, I my first look wasn't great. Now I'm going to kind of run around a little bit. And once again, he's young. He's going to be a 21-year-old rookie throughout his entire rookie season, but he would be the guy I'm the lowest on in both fantasy and I like that, maybe because, like you said, the draft capital, McCarthy goes top 15. Penix and Nix end up going a little later than that. And then it kind of changes the perception of them in fantasy, where I like the upside of both Nix and Penix from fantasy more than McCarthy's long term.
Interesting. Let's move to wide receiver. Are you aware that in best ball drafts right now, Marvin Harrison Jr. is going like mid-second round? He's got
Tell me who he's going over, I think would really, really be the mind blower here.
Okay, so let me sort by ADP.
I mean, that ADP is alone has got to be some big names he's going over.
So yeah, Marvin Harrison Jr., he's going over Rashee Rice, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Chris Olave, Tank Dell, Michael Pittman. Those are the wide receivers going right after him. Drafters are pretty psyched about Marvin Harrison. Are you, I mean, obviously he's like, is he, I guess the question is like, is he more can't miss, or is he sort of immediate superstar, right? Because I know it's a bulletproof prospect profile, but do you know what I mean? Like, should we be drafting this guy like he's immediately going to hit the ground running as a star, or is it more just like, I know this guy's going to be a good number one at the NFL level?
I think that there's the fear factor of what if he really did go to New England at 3? I think there's just, not that he can't overcome limitations in an offense, but that roster on paper offensively is, there's nothing good about it. Honestly, the line's bad. They have no quarterback. They have no receivers. Which do you counter? Okay, he's going to get 8 million targets year one, and it just doesn't matter. Maybe,
right? Maybe
it does. I need to know some kind of floor under center. Like, did they go out and sign Jacoby Brissett? Did they? You know what I mean? I need some kind of floor under center. But I'm not surprised to hear that. Maybe over Ayuk a little bit, because what if either Ayuk stays in San Francisco and he's still great, or Ayuk goes somewhere, and what if he's the guy, the number one, and more targets are funneled his way? But I'm not shocked to hear that. With Marv, here's the thing. He's big. He's fast. He's very clean, the way he tracks the ball. He's a good route runner. His release package is getting better. I think it's the only thing you could really nitpick at. But he can make the difficult play. He's strong through contact. He's very fast with the ball in his hands. He plays extremely hard. He's kind of a unicorn. The best receiver prospect I've ever evaluated is Jamar Chase. And I'll probably have Marv side by side with Chase. Everybody, I feel like, is going to lean that he's just better. I don't know. I think we're quickly forgetting how special Chase was as a prospect, because one, he didn't play his final college season. So he was 19 or 20 out there running by people in the SEC.
Outproducing Justin Jefferson.
Right. Like, people really do forget. And he's been amazing in the NFL. Shocking. So I would say side by side with Chase, which is pretty enormous praise. And then you try to factor in that, hey, there's a really, really, really good chance he ends up in Arizona. Kyler's going to let that thing go. It's going to be, Hollywood's going to leave in free agency. So you're just in a situation that offense might be good. Honestly, it really might be good, and he might be the lead of it. So I'm not surprised to hear that. Marvin Harrison, it's interesting to look back now, Pat. He was my number one player on my first big board in August. And a lot of people, rightfully so, were like, damn, over Caleb Williams. And I look back at it, he's just the best player in the draft. He's the best. He has the least amount of questions. He has probably as much upside. I understand that a quarterback is always going to have more upside positional value-wise, but the upside with him is that he's the best receiver in the NFL in 3 years. The worst case is he's top 12. It's pretty rare territory.
Pretty nice.
Yeah. That's why.
So the next two guys, generally in the draft community, or if we're projecting draft capital, is Nabers and then Odunze. Although it seems like Odunze could go ahead of Nabers in the best ball market. It's Nabers in kind of his own tier. He's got an ADP of 36. and Odunze is at 57. So they're kind of each in their own tier. Pretty big gap from Harrison to Nabers, and then another gap between Nabers and Odunze. My general feeling is like, take these guys. But any thoughts on? I know you really like Nabers. I think am I like crazy? Like in another class, we'd probably be talking ourselves into Nabers, maybe even another 8 picks higher than this. It's just like, if you really want to get hyped about a rookie wide receiver, you got Harrison.
That's the issue with him. I mean, Nabers is my 4th overall player. It's literally Marvin Harrison Jr., Joe Alt, Caleb Williams, Malik Nabers. He's a DJ Moore clone. He, in any other draft, typically, besides Chase's draft, he's the top receiver. He's truly become the Waddle now of this class, where you look at him and you're like, man, most drafts, he's the number 1 receiver. He is phenomenal with the ball in his hands. He wins over the top with speed. He is really, really hard to run with. He's, once again, just dynamic is really the way I would say it. You could scheme underneath to him. You can scheme over the top to him. He could play inside and outside. He's just a tremendous player. I think you could do things with him in motion in the backfield where you're just trying to find ways to get the ball in his hands and have him run. So, and I agree with that gap, by the way. Odunze, I like a lot. I think that there is a tier difference between him and Nabers, and I'm a little surprised a lot of the mock drafts lately have had Odunze either going higher or going right with him. And Odunze is a good prospect in his own right. He's just very different. He's not the same creator with the ball in his hands. Odunze has a sprinting background, and he's going to run well, but I don't think he constantly runs away from people on tape where Nabers does. And Nabers did that in the SEC. So I would evaluate it the same way. I actually think, and I think this is something you hinted at, Nabers will be underappreciated, whether it's best ball drafts, whether it's dynasty drafts, whether it's redraft. He'll be a really interesting redraft player because Marv's in this draft and he's getting all of the wide receiver focus, where now is there some value with Nabers depending where he goes because he's an elite talent at a position that matters so much and can really go in and have success right away, in my opinion. I would bet on the over if his over-under was set at 1,000 yards as a rookie.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, I think when you look at like the dynasty stuff, Harrison's going, he'll go ahead of at least one of the quarterbacks, and Nabers will probably not, where all 3 of the top quarterbacks go ahead of him.
I agree.
So, I mean, that's pretty good value for a prospect of his caliber, I think. As we go
last year, sorry to cut you off. What were we getting at that spot last year? You know what I mean? It was totally different tier of player. Would it be JSN?
It'd be JSN, yeah.
I mean, I liked JSN a lot, but this is a totally different tier of player.
So, yeah, because, I mean, JSN had a pretty interesting statistical profile, but he was like, is more of a slot, more of, kind of a PPR type guy. But he was an early declare out of Ohio State, had played with Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, like very high pedigree. But even with that, you see a pretty big difference between Nabers and JSN.
Yeah, I think Nabers, it's the ability to play inside and outside with the straight line speed that JSN didn't have. JSN had elite agility metrics, but I mean, Nabers is just straight gas, straight line.
Yep. After Odunze, it's interesting because some of the dynasty stuff I'm seeing, it's like Troy Franklin, Brian Thomas Jr., kind of in like neck and neck, Keon Coleman right there. But in best ball, Thomas is kind of in his own tier. In the big board ADP, he's at 81. No other rookie wide receivers have an ADP above 109. So it's like Thomas. That actually kind of makes sense to me. Is he kind of like fairly locked in for round 1 where Coleman, we got Franklin. Some of these other guys, Franklin, but then also we could see A.D. Mitchell, Roman Wilson, like it kind of on and on of these guys who could sneak into like pick 32. But Thomas looks, at least to me, like, he could go mid first, but it would be kind of a shock if he were to fall completely out of the first round. Is that how you feel as well?
I'd be floored. I mean, Thomas is a top 20 player for me. I have him 17th, only a couple spots behind Odunze. I think that it's interesting when you watch Jayden Daniels and you realize how gifted Nabers and Thomas are at the position in an
Mhm.
offense that can throw the ball down the field. He had 15 touchdowns this year while averaging 18 yards per reception. The leaping ability, contested catch situations, acrobatic. Uh, he really, two things stand out to me when I watch Thomas and how I fell in love with him. One, the production would have been higher because of two reasons. One, he shared an offense with Malik Nabers. Okay, that's pretty fair. And then two, for as good as Jayden Daniels is, there was a lot of deep balls that were underthrown. And that's
Mm.
Thomas's game. Thomas runs by people down the field all the time. And there was a lot of meat left on the bone where it's like, hey, if that deep ball's there, there's another 50 and another touchdown. So I think when you look at Thomas, he's going to be valued extremely highly in this draft, which is bodes well, right? Because of course, landing spot is massive for a player like this. Let's say Calvin Ridley leaves Jacksonville and Jacksonville takes Thomas at 17. You feel really good about that. As much
Yeah.
as Trevor Lawrence has been a little hot and cold and not what we thought, you still feel good about the situation, the quarterback,
He's willing
the
to take
offense.
chances.
And he will throw the ball down the field, which
Yeah.
is that fits Thomas right there. What if Cincinnati does the unthinkable and trades T. Higgins and they take him at 18? I mean, wipe your hands. You're feeling phenomenal about that. And then it comes down. He just has landing spot upside. Like you said, what if he falls down in round one? Okay. I mean, Baltimore, San Francisco, Kansas City. I don't see him making
Buffalo.
it there. Buffalo's the big one because if Gabe's going to leave, it sounds like, and
Yeah.
they need
Yeah.
a field stretcher.
If
Yeah,
he's
Buffalo's
Gabe
gonna
Davis,
fall.
like wheels up.
I mean, 100%, because then you're just taking out the volatility that existed with Gabe Davis every single week that gave us all
Right.
headaches. But I think he's going higher than that. So yeah, I would have him in him and Franklin I really, really liked. And then I saw a bit of a difference. It was amazing stacking this class because it was like, okay, Marv, great, Nabers, phenomenal. I like Odunze, Thomas, and Franklin, kind of in this interesting spectrum. And then it's like, okay, Devontae Walker, Keon Coleman, Jalen Polk. You brought up
Yeah.
AD Mitchell. Like they were down the board a little bit for me. There was a
Okay.
difference.
Okay. Well, yeah, so one just thing on Thomas real quick, because he had one of the statistical red flags that popped for me is that he had a pretty high contested catch rate on deep balls. And that, especially because he didn't have a super high contested catch rate. So it's like this guy, generally I'm like, does that mean that we're talking about a guy, and this is a Quentin Johnston red flag last year, had the same thing. This guy can't separate deep and he's not great at catching the ball in contested catch situations. That could be a real problem. And I think Quentin Johnston would be kind of the poster boy for what that looks like at the NFL level. But what I'm hearing about Thomas is, he can separate deep. Maybe he's getting contested catches because of where the ball placement was on some of those deep throws.
That's exactly it. And God forbid you say that because you can't say anything bad about Jayden Daniels. But it's a real thing on tape. And
Okay.
isn't it amazing, Quentin Johnson, in that draft, we had this thought in our head that, I'm trying to make sure I have where he measured in correctly. I feel like he came in a lot shorter than we thought. And he's listed 6'4", 215. I thought for some reason he did not measure in the same way. I expect Thomas to be at least 6'3". So that would, let's see. Quentin Johnson came in 6'2" and 3/4. They still list him 6'4" in the NFL, even though his official measurement was 6'2" and over that. But
still growing.
Yeah, you're right. Exactly. So yeah, Thomas he's got really good length. He's got a pretty crazy high school basketball background. He was the most outstanding player in his state championship game. So like you watch him play and you're like, yeah, this is what a basketball player playing wide receiver looks like at 6'4" and did jump out of the stadium.
Fast Drake London, is that a comp?
That's not the craziest thing. I need to, once the combine comes in, I'll do comps for every single player because I'm just I've become such a stickler for body types. You do a comp in like November and then you're like, cool, the comp I had is 20 pounds lighter and 3 inches shorter. Like that was a waste of time. So it's a very weird process.
Speaking of body type, Troy Franklin is listed, depending on where you look, he can be like 179.
He's Will Fuller.
Yeah, like I'm concerned a little bit about the weight. I would love, like, it's funny how I have these like rooting interests, these very niche rooting interests, but like if Troy Franklin comes in at like 192 at the combine, I'm fist pumping. Like,
Me too.
That's amazing. But I'm worried he could come in like, 181. I mean, he's very tall. He looks lanky out on the field.
He
But
does.
he also, I loved what you guys were saying about his route running, varying his speeds, and the dude has a lot of speed. Like, that just jumps out as soon as you watch him. You're like, man, he can accelerate. He's got he's just really fast at full speed as well. Really exciting guy, in a similar kind of landing spot stuff of like, what if he's with the Chiefs? What if he's with the Bills?
Yep.
And that's kind of the opportunity that he has, potentially falling in the late first. Maybe he goes early second and the landing spot isn't quite as juicy, but the upside for that is there. And he fits so well with some of these elite quarterbacks, I think. And a huge gap between him and Brian Thomas, where he's going at pick 109, pick 110, actually. I don't know. Like, I don't see that big of a difference between him and Thomas, even though Thomas's draft capital does look more locked in.
Right. I had Thomas 17th overall and Franklin 19th overall. And then, maybe I just love this wide receiver class more than a lot of, other people or however they see it. And I do think Thomas is a little bit better at finishing plays, but Franklin, he primarily played on the outside, number one. So if we're worrying about the size and the weight, well, we've seen him win on the outside, and I do think he can get up to 180. I don't think he's going to Jalen Hyatt this thing where Hyatt came in at 176 and he ran 4.4. I think Franklin will legitimately run a 4.3 at 180 plus, which is a big time. That's a big time for someone like that. His first step off the line of scrimmage is just, you could freeze frame it on tape every single time. You're like, oh, he's dictating the rep every single time, and the corner has to react rather than, setting the rep. He's got good length. I thought that he plays fast in the short area, but knows how to open up for the long speed. And I think he runs really, he's excellent at changing tempo in his routes. That corners were kind of kept on their toes very often. So you think of a guy like that with Allen, Mahomes, Lamar, whatever you want to say, the possibilities are extremely, extremely promising. Now, if Franklin, you brought up the draft projection a little bit. If Franklin falls out of the first round and we're stuck with him going to Carolina or something like that, then that's the risk associated, I think, with him compared to Thomas.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it might have been Bleacher Report's mock draft had that exact landing spot where he falls just that one extra pick, and you're like, no,
you just fall to your knees screaming into the sky.
You really do. Yeah, so that risk is real. Some of the guys after that in ADP, Keon Coleman, A.D. Mitchell, Lad McConkey, Xavier Worthy, Jalen Polk. That's kind of the next sort of tier. It kind of ends after Worthy, actually. There's like another 20 picks down to Polk. That's sort of the tier in best ball ADP. Thoughts on those guys? I know Coleman's going to be kind of controversial. I'm not really even sure exactly where I stand on him yet.
I think Polk is really interesting because there's so much to his game that reminds me of Chris Godwin, where he just does dirty work over the middle of the field or any area of the field with excellent concentration, that it's just going to work, right? It might not be 60-yard touchdowns or a number one wide receiver in an offense or anything like that, but you just watch him and you just know that he's going to be trusted early, and that coaches are going to like him, and that his quarterback's going to trust him, and that he's going to play a brand of football that not a lot of guys are equipped to play anymore. That's why I'm very high on Polk. Coleman, I mean, you just have to be honest with this one. There is so much projection to his game that absolutely scares you, while there's so much that excites you. This is a guy that legitimately came to Michigan State to play basketball and football. Michigan State. It's not like he was at like a D3 program and it's like, yeah, I could do both. I mean, he thought he could play basketball at Michigan State. And you see the above the rim ability, huge frame. Sometimes tacklers really hesitate, but there's nothing to his routes. They're all the same pace. He doesn't run away from people. He only had 200+ yard games this season. I mean, that was a big red flag for me with Quentin Johnston. It's like, this guy's deemed as maybe the top receiver in the draft. He didn't dominate for 60, 50, 40% of the season. He dominated for 20% of the season. So When you look at Coleman, his touches are screens and jump balls. And he might have been playing hurt a lot of this season, which makes you wonder, is there more here that was hidden on tape? But he is a true all traits guy. If you just throw him out there and you're like, yeah, he's going to separate or he's going to be relied upon right away, that's not what he could be drafted to do. Well, I feel like Polk, the ceiling is a lot more limited, but a lot more reliable. I feel the same way with a guy like Ricky Persall from Florida. Leggett scares me a little bit right now.
Leggett scares me too. He came in a lot smaller than people thought, right?
Yeah. I mean, your build is this monster, 6'4", 230-pound, nobody could tackle me thread, and he's 6'1", and
if you're 6'1", that doesn't work as well.
His ball skills in Mobile were wildly inconsistent. I think you have to scheme to him a lot, which how's he going to run? I hope he runs really well. He's a late breakout. And credit to him. I mean, a lot of people at that program talk about how he put his head down. He didn't jump in the portal. He played special teams for a couple of years, and then it all worked for him his last year. But he's legitimately a one-year wonder as a wide receiver. I have a big fear factor with Leggett, and it's a shame because he's a good story. But I would have a lot of these guys ahead of him, including McConkey, Mitchell, and probably Worthy as well.
Yeah, he actually is going behind all those guys. After him, though, is Tez Walker, who I like quite
a bit ahead of him.
Are your any worries about Walker falling in the draft? I've seen sort of inconsistent draft projections for him.
He didn't have a good week in Mobile. And it was frustrating because he was one of the people that can really run away from people. When you watch Walker on tape, he chews up so much turf with each stride. He's got these long strides. And in Mobile, I mean, even he can get away from a guy like Quinyon Mitchell at times, who's the best corner there. But he just didn't finish a lot of plays. And it's very, very frustrating. You got to catch the ball. And I think that Walker also, he had the NCAA issue that was more the NCAA, not him, but of him getting on the field late this year, where he didn't get to play a ton of football. He was very good when he played. I had a couple more notes on him. I think one of the main things too with Walker that can hurt him a little bit in this class is that he's somebody that there's just no creativity with the ball in his hands. It's like, okay, I made the catch, not a big change of direction, not a tackle breaker. Like, I just made the catch. Let's finish the play. When you talk about everybody else in this draft, they could either run 100 miles an hour or make three people miss or run through your face. So that's, I think, what kind of is going to hurt him a little bit as well.
Yeah, I was watching him, just my initial stuff. I was like, he pops a lot in a lot of the statistical stuff, and I'm like, I can't help but just feel like he's a little Justin Huntery.
Oh, that's an interesting one. That's a really interesting one. They have the same exact body.
They do. I mean, and that's why it jumped out to me. But and he was also kind of, I've made the catch. Now I'm done.
Yeah, and it's just not the league anymore. It's all spacing and creating yards and unless you're just an unstoppable force, right? Like unless you're like T. Higgins above the rim, right? I think he's good. I think he's pretty refined in terms of completing plays on tape. That's why it was so bizarre in Mobile that he wasn't.
Interesting.
I
do like him. He makes me a little nervous, but I'm drafting a lot of them. To get you before we get out of here, just want to ask you a couple of the guys in the late rounds. You mentioned Ricky Persall, so I'm just gonna go through the guys who are going pick 198 or later in best ball draft. So these are like your true dart throws.
Yeah.
Malachi Corley, Brennan Rice, Malik Washington, Ricky Persall, Jermaine Burton, Luke McCaffrey, Johnny Wilson, Jacob Cowing, Jalen McMillan, and Jamari Thrash.
I was waiting for that last one.
Okay. I haven't taken a ton of Thrash. He looks pretty small to me. Like, he's kind of like a slot guy. Is that the idea?
Kind of, but he also is so fast that I think he can win on the outside. He's over 6 feet tall. He's a little lighter, but I mean, he is so quick and elusive, and his feet on double moves froze guys constantly. So I thought he tracks the deep ball really, really well. He also carried that over into Mobile. I know he was playing with an injury a lot this year, and then you see him healthy in Mobile, and it's like, yeah, this is the guy I thought he would be. Him and Persall, out of the names you brought up, are the most intriguing to me. I mean, they get open. They have a good release package. They find the ball. They can work all three levels of the field. Uh, I think those guys are in a different class than the rest of those guys. Corley will be a popular name. Corley is, man, he's going to be interesting. There's just not a lot of players like that are so gifted after the catch, but theoretically you would think are kind of, have to be schemed too. He's like built like a fire hydrant. I want to see if he's going to consistently separate or if he's pigeonholed into the slot and it's all manufactured touches. Different player, but how Zay Flowers was used this year. With Zay, it was like, okay, he got 7 targets, 5 of them were screens. Like, is that going to be Corley's life, depending where he goes? But Persall, I feel pretty comfortable. Persall is going to be a legit, like, NFL starter in 11 personnel for a long time.
It's the gap between him and Lad McConkey is kind of wild to me. It's like you got to pay up for not a ton for McConkey in these drafts, but it's not. There's like solid veterans going in that range, and then Persall's free.
I might have Persall ranked higher than him at the end of this. And I like McConkey. McConkey's awesome, but that's got to be correct. That will be corrected. So take him for free while you can.
Yeah, take Persall.
It can't hurt.
Burton is a guy I've been taking a lot of. It sounds like you're not as into. I mean,
I was just late on him. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't get to him when we did our top 15 wide receivers, and I regretted it. But the good thing is we do wide receivers like 4 times because it's the best group to do it. You get the dynasty community, you get the best ball community, you get the draft fans, the NFL fans, and we do our final rankings after the combine because if a guy goes full Jawan Jennings and runs a 4.72, it's like, okay, this actually matters a little bit. So yeah, Burton will be. I think he'll end up being in my top 15 with the final recheck.
Okay, nice. All right, well, didn't get to running backs or tight ends, but those classes are basically... Actually, do you want to do that real quick? Brock Bowers and Jonathan Brooks. Is there anyone to talk about other than those guys?
Jatavion Sanders at tight end. He's really interesting because he shared targets in an offense with A.D. Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, Jordan Whittington. Jonathan Brooks was getting handoffs before he got hurt. Like, I didn't think Quinn Ewers was very good, honestly. So it's not like an offense that had elite quarterbacking. I thought it was a little underwhelming. So Sanders, when he got there, everybody thought he'd be a future first-round pick. Then this year, nobody cared about him. And now that we're back full circle and he's in the draft, everyone's like, you know what? He should probably go in the top 50 because he's a pretty gifted athlete for the position. So I don't know how Sanders is being valued in best ball, but he should be, is the point.
He's like 176. He's someone I've been taking a fair amount of because tight end tends to dry up pretty quickly.
Yeah, I would. There's just not a lot of tight ends in the league right now that can run like him and be an actual... if he went to an offense that treated Laporta the way the Lions and Ben Johnson did, he's not the blocker Laporta was, but you could see the usage of lining up almost anywhere and actually factoring into their pass game.
Bowers, in dynasty drafts, he's like, he's going fairly high, but he's not really in the mix like the way Kyle Pitts was to go ahead of any of these like really, ahead in the quarterbacks.
Everyone's
not going ahead of. I would be interested in taking him ahead of Odunze. Like, I think he's
with you.
This is tight end premium take, but like he's a run blocker. Like Pitts was first percentile in PFF run blocking grade coming in. Bowers can legit run block. Like that means you're out there for play action. That means you're out there around the goal line for play action. Like I don't think he's going to score 1 touchdown this year the way Pitts did as a rookie.
No, he can't. And Bowers is pretty well equipped to go somewhere that you're excited about. I mean, it starts with the Chargers at 5, and then he's in play, all the way to the Colts at 15. And there's just landing spots that you really like with him.
Yeah.
He's so gifted after the catch that Pitts was really a big wide receiver, almost Darren Waller-ish. Bowers is more Kittle to me. Like it's a totally different brand of football. And I will be taking him if the opportunity presents itself over Odunze.
Okay, nice. Running back real quick. Brooks strikes me as like, again, this is sort of best ball specific where like the late season production matters so much more than the early season production. We're drafting rookies for late season production. Anyway, he's going, I think I maybe have pushed him finally above pick 130. He's going like in the mid 130s for a while.
Wow.
I think he's he should be in the top 100 for me. Like I actually think maybe even significantly higher than that. Like you could talk me into him pretty high. Like I loved what I saw from him. Pretty strong, not amazing statistical prospect, but good. Yeah, he's coming off the ACL. I want a discount on that, but it seems like he's still going to get drafted day 2, probably installed as a guy who's going to emerge as the starter over the course of the season, the way many rookies are set up to do. I mean, am I right to be kind of hammering this guy right now in drafts?
I think so. I think Brooks was the most exciting guy before he got hurt in a class that left a lot to be desired, especially when Travion Henderson went back to school. That was one where, him and Donovan Edwards, they go back to school. They were pretty explosive to me. I think there's a floor with guys like Corum and Benson, but with Brooks, yeah, I mean, he's probably the first running back off the board, even with the ACL. He's probably back end round 2, depending where he lands. But I would be thinking the same thing for best ball format. That feels like a big discount that's all factored into injury because the tape was very, very good. He is somebody that's a creative runner. He's got good size that he can come in and, handle whatever work share you feel like the coaching staff is asking of him. So yeah, I would be pretty higher on him too. It's not an exciting running back class, but I think his injury, kind of masked his value in a way.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. Any of the other guys, like Audric Estime's jumped out to me a little bit. Braylon Allen's massive and super young and kind of interesting. Bucky Irving looks like he could be like a receiving back type. I like Benson a fair amount. Corum I haven't loved, but I think he could get installed as like a 2-down guy, and
yeah,
we're happy with that. Frank Gore Jr. is sometimes someone I think about like super late, like last round. Dylan Laube or Laub, I don't know how to pronounce, but he's kind of interesting as like a pass catcher. I think you guys mentioned him as like a Danny Woodhead type of dude. Ray Davis gets a little bit of buzz. Any of these guys jump out? Marshawn Lloyd, I should mention.
Yeah, a couple more. I mean, Will Shipley out of Clemson, he didn't have a great year, but in 2022 he went for over 1,100 yards, and the more important thing is he's caught 70 passes the last 2 years. So Shipley's going to catch the ball, and I think he's going to be put into that role right away. I'm really interested in him. And then, the grinded out, like nobody will care about him, but I think he's a good player, is Ray Davis, the Kentucky running back. It's almost like he's built like Mike Tolbert. He just does everything the right way. He's 225 pounds. He's short, but it kind of helps him bounce off of contact. He catches the ball. I think he can block. Davis is someone that I feel like no one really cares about right now. And it feels like we'll be talking about him in November of waiver wires of like, hey, somebody got hurt. The staff loves Ray Davis. He just keeps falling into the end zone.
Brian Thomas kind of vibes where he's like, coaches love this guy, even if we don't understand why.
No, I like him though. Like I think
Brian Robinson. I said Brian Thomas. I meant Brian Robinson.
Robinson's a good call out where it's, does everything asked of him, reliable with the football, and can grind out yards and be a red zone back or really be anything you need him to be. So yeah, I would definitely look at it that way. Shipley is very interesting. That's one I would keep an eye on.
Okay. Yeah. He wasn't that high. I have him actually a little bit behind ADP, so I'll be bumping him up. But all right, we got to let you get out of here so you can do NFL Stock Exchange, so that I can listen to the episode as soon as possible. So, but appreciate you jumping on, man. This is a ton of fun. Everyone check out Fantasy Football Happy Hour, NFL Stock Exchange. What episode are you guys going to be recording?
We are doing a no notes today, which is just like general topics, but the end of the week we are doing quarterbacks. So that's going to be a doozy. And the full thing, we're going to have at least 10 ranked. So it's a pretty big week, honestly.
All right. Great stuff, man. Appreciate it.
Dude,
thanks so much for coming on. Absolutely. We'll be back on this feed with more rookie talk later in the week. See everyone then.